Hey y'all, this video is going to be a deep dive on fabric and form. If you want to see me demo this painting and give you some of my best secrets to painting fabric convincingly, then stick around. So first I'm going to start with some housekeeping. Here is my reference photo. Y'all are free to use it. All I ask is that if you share it on social media, just make sure to tag me, because remember, credit is currency for artists, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the shout out. Plus, honestly, I just really like to see when you guys interpret these reference photos into your own paintings. It's always a really fun experience. So why might painting fabric be helpful for an artist who's learning how to paint form? And just to keep everything in layman's terms, because I feel like a big part of learning how to be an artist and a painter is actually just learning vocabulary. Sure, there is power in sitting down and painting, but I also think that there's power in taking sort of these more ambiguous art terms, or at least terms that are hard to sort of pin down, and putting them into an actual skill set. I think it makes navigating painting so much easier when those things are lined up. So why is learning form so helpful? So in this composition, you can see, even in the reference photo, that because of the lighting and the texture and the information, we understand that the flowers aren't three-dimensional flowers that are sort of surrounding the swan figurines, but rather we understand that it's fabric. And you might ask yourself, well, how does someone understand that from the reference photo and hopefully with your painting? And the key here is form. The swan figurines look like they have depth and three-dimensionality because of the way that the light's hitting it and sort of encompassing and creating halftones on the corners and the soft edges of the figurines, aka it looks three-dimensional because there's highlights and shadows. And it's not to say that there's not highlights and shadows on the fabric. You can see that there's a cast shadow on the fabric from the swan figurines. However, the way that those forms are built up, sort of the flatness of the fabric versus the three-dimensionality of the swans, there's contrast, which helps the viewer distinguish that the flowers are not actual physical flowers, but rather fabric. So how do we do that as a painter? Because if you don't have the skill set, what ends up happening is you may have been aiming to create this great little vintage fabric under your composition, under your figurines. That may have been your goal, and you might have your own reference photo that looks like this. But so many times I've seen my students, and certainly in my own practice, before I had sort of some of these skill sets, it would just look busy and confusing. And we can see here, even in my painting, so I'm going back in with my second redraw with those burgundy lines, that even at that phase, and granted it looks unfinished, there's a flatness to everything that makes the composition feel kind of confusing. Like if my husband walked into my studio and saw the painting at this step of the process, he might not exactly know what's going on with my painting. It's like, is this, a garden? What's going on? I mean, it only takes a little bit of extra looking at it to sort of understand that perhaps this is fabric. But as painters, especially representational painters, we want there to be a relative amount of clarity between what is flat form. So whether it's fabric or a CD cover or a book cover or written word or something like that versus three-dimensional object. In fact, I can remember back in college, I set up a still life. This would have been like 2013, 2012. And my still life was called a hipster still life. And I had a record player and, cigarettes and a bunch of other iconically hipster things. And I remember I had a cutout of a magazine, I think like a New York Times cover or something, and it had an illustration of a bulldog on it. And the thing that was really kind of tripping me up in this composition was that the bulldog kept reading like it was like a stuffed animal bulldog or something. And I remember I spent so much time trying to paint the bulldog that eventually my painting professor came around, put me out of my mercy, and said, the trick is you have to render the rest of your painting to make it look more two-dimensional in contrast to the dimensionality of everything else. So of course I did that. It helped a ton, and it was a very big light bulb moment for me. And it's not to say that anytime I ever painted fabric or anything two-dimensional after that, it was easy, but rather I knew the game I was playing, which in terms of learning how to paint representationally is so helpful. So what is that game? In this case, to make it very simple out of the gate, you're making sure that your fabric reads flatter. Well, what does flatter mean? So flat versus form basically just means that the swans have sort of a contour and there are subtle gradations of value. So you can see even on the swan's head, I use multiple shades of sort of this off-white color, and it builds up to a point on sort of the highlight of the swan, where if it was a swan pattern in the fabric, I wouldn't have all those details. Even if the details were illustrated in the fabric, I would make the choice to make sure that that's flatter. And so conversely, with the fabric, I choose to make all of my decisions a little more simple, flatter, and more muted than it is in real life. So one thing that I talk about in the new fabric demo section that's coming next month for Not Sorry Art School, so in August of 2024, if you're watching this after, it's already out, as I talk about something called the hierarchy of visual interest, which is basically just understanding that there's a hierarchy of what jumps out to the viewer. And as painters, we have to learn this. And so by understanding this hierarchy, you're able to organize things. The part of the hierarchy that's really relevant to this particular composition is the contrast. So there's going to be less contrast between the values for the fabric and the pattern, and a little more contrast with the swans. There's also going to be more detail with the swans because we want them to jump out to the viewer's eye quicker than the fabric, as well as more opportunity for high chroma. And I will say where this gets a little less cut and dry is that the part of the fabric that jumps towards the viewer, so at the very bottom foreground, can be a little bit higher in chroma than the fabric in the background. But as far as detail and contrast, by sort of making the fabric less contrasty, so the lights are a little less light and the darks are a little less dark. I think in this case I just made my dark leafy green quite a bit lighter to have it read less contrasty by sort of amplifying that. So it's not that I'm not paying attention to my reference photo, I'm just using this knowledge that I built up through years of painting, this hierarchy of visual interest, to translate what I'm doing. So if you've ever seen my videos on warming and cooling, you'll know that I do the same thing there, right? Things that are in sunlight tend to be a little bit lighter in value and a little bit warmer. Things that are in shadow are cooler and ever so slightly darker. It's not to say that when you're looking at your reference photo, you don't see that, but it's more to say that understanding that dynamic helps you to make better color choices, which help the viewer see what you're trying to make them see. And in this case, I'm trying to have the viewer read the swan figurines as three-dimensional form and the pattern as one flat sort of surface. Even though it recedes back into space, it's flat. Like there's not actual plastic flowers next to the swan, that it reads as though it is fabric. And I always think of the hierarchy of visual interest is to form. So form is sort of the combination of value and drawing. I always say as painters, we are juggling color, value, and drawing. So value is how light or how dark, color is obviously color, drawing is obviously drawing. So to simplify painting, what are you doing? You're sort of taking into consider those three things always in sort of like a juggling fashion, right? That's why I use it as an analogy. But when we're making decisions about form, we keep the hierarchy of visual interest in mind. So things that are high contrast jump forward, things that are highly saturated or high chroma jump forward, and things that are detailed jump forward. Things that are low contrast recede, things that are low chroma recede, and things that are less detailed recede. And that is to form as the color wheel is to color. And so in fact, I will even have my students print out the download, stick it on their easel next to their color wheel, especially as they're learning, as a way to sort of continually check in with those principles, especially if creating depth and flatness or vice versa, any combination of that, handling depth and flatness is something that you're interested in. So if you've ever struggled with creating dimensionality, flatness, something's flat that you want to be dimensional, whatever your problem is, if it's with the form and not the color, then having a really good handle on what jumps out to the viewer's eye first is basically like a cheat sheet. It's going to help you tremendously. So, I would write that down, stick it on your easel, or at least just consider it whenever you're making a painting. Thank y'all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this demo and learning about form. If you would like to learn more, you can subscribe for free content, or if you want to learn about my art school, make sure to sign up for the email list in the links below.